Presentation is going to be on Sergei Prokofiev, who is a Russian composer, and I think probably one of the most unique composers. Just in general. He wrote solo piano pieces, operas, film scores, symphonies, everything you can think of, concertos. I'll be sharing his life story and kind of his legacy as a musical rule breaker. So he was born on an estate, a large estate owned by his father, April 1881 or 1891, which is now known as Ukraine. And his mother really understood the value of art. She came from like a poor family, so I mean that's why they kind of said that she, not saying that, but I'm just But so he learned to play the piano through his mother. He was a child prodigy. He showed signs of high promise, and he wanted to compose his own music and began writing pieces at 5 years old. And his mom actually wrote them down for him. I thought that was kind of funny. His parents continued to supervise his early arts education, and then enrolled him at the Moscow Conservatory at age 11, which was kind of crazy, which made him kind of an outlier. The summer before going to the conservatory, he took composition lessons with Reinhold Glieri and learned all the basic rules of composition. And little did his teacher know he would be kind of breaking every rule that he taught him. Then at 13, after 2 summers of study with him, his parents were convinced he needed to study at St. Petersburg, which was another conservatory. And he studied under Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who was a famed composer in Russia. And with regard to his compositions, even his early ones, Prokofiev, he kind of rejected the sound of previous romantic composers, because they would have jarring dissonances, and sometimes he would be afraid to show it to his composition teachers in fear of being kicked out of the conservatory. But he continually wowed his professors, and he kind of got the reputation there as like a musical bad boy or something. But yeah, he was at the time he was described as avant-garde with a tendency to shock. He was very inspired by composer Stravinsky and pianist Scriabin. And in 1910, during his studies, his father died and he had no way of able to financially support himself. And he wrote 2 piano concerti, but they both suffered terrible reviews, and he didn't really get any money off that. And his audience wasn't really pleased with the music either, which I think definitely made sense at the time, just because it was so different, and he had such like a completely separate vision from what any romantic composers kind of thought of, or any music that they really heard before then. But on the other hand, people that were part of the modernist movement really saw like the prowess and the beauty in his concerto, and held in high regard his melodic lyricism. And then he graduated from the St. Petersburg Conservatory in 1914, having won the Rubinstein competition, playing his own pieces. But shortly after, I thought this was kind of funny, in 1916, Prokofiev went back to St. Petersburg to study the organ, to avoid the draft for World War I. He was not drafted because he was, it was an interesting thing, he was the only living man living with his mother, because his mother was a widow, so they couldn't legally draft him.
That's saving private time.
And then with his country, in the midst of a revolution in 1919, he decided to move to the U.S. U.S., he excited audiences and also debuted operas, and then so he was pretty successful in the U.S. And a few years later, he moved to Paris, where he composed and performed his most famous and very successful operas, Sandhills, Suite, and Shout, and wrote 3 piano concerti, one of them being the famed third concerto that everyone wants to play. And then the massive success of these operas made him return to the concertos made him return to the United States. Actually, he returned to the United States and he debuted his third concerto in Chicago. And then this is where his career gets kind of weird. So in 1924, there's an interesting shift. He registered as a Soviet citizen, and in interviews, he was recorded saying that he intends to abide by the Soviet arts policy. And between 1924 and 1936, he composed operas and wrote film scores, but was all commissioned by the Soviets and published throughout Russia. And then in 1936, he permanently returned to his home country, which was pretty interesting, because typically if you got out of the USSR, you wouldn't want to go back. So it was probably for some sort of money thing, or they were trying to convince him of something. But the even weirder thing is that he returned to the USSR, or to Russia when the Soviet regime was starting to censor the arts more. Although it was during this bizarre political time, he returned. He still composed many pieces, and he was commissioned for all of them, film scores, operas, and he was commissioned for anything that he was working on. And even though he was working on a lot of music, he seemed to be kind of slowly getting closed in and beaten down by the censorship restrictions. Stalin even suppressed an opera of his, Semyon Gotko, that was written and this was really interesting. It was written in a form called Soviet realism, meaning it conforms to what the Soviet government wanted music in their country to sound like. But even then, Stalin still suppressed his stuff because it was pretty out there. Even the premiere of his Romeo and Juliet pieces was delayed until 1940 by authorities. The playing of a cantata he wrote for the 20th anniversary of the Russian Revolution was never approved by the Soviets. So he definitely, he experienced his fair share of systematic oppression with his music. And his works during the mid-1940s are typically all Soviet realists in some way. The censorship in Russia grew more and more tightened, and basically all the arts had to represent the state in some way. And during this, Prokofiev did tone down his music to fit this regime. This isn't to say that the music he made during this time wasn't beautiful and genius works, but they were influenced by these negative aspects of government. And this is kind of another sign of the government really closing in on him. During World War II, oppression was still rising, and his wife was arrested on suspicion of spying, and she was found guilty. So that kind of put a bit of a scare into him, frightened his step. And even through all these pressing times, he still composed a lot of music. And in 1942, we have the piece that we'll be listening to today, the Piano Sonata No. 7, which is a piece amidst 3 sonatas called the War Sonatas, and those are numbers 6, 7, and 8. And this sonata was finished when Prokofiev had fled to Caucasus Mountains from Moscow to escape German invaders. And I kind of said, I think that this feeling is definitely captured in this sonata. It almost sounds like the piano is kind of on a journey of escape with playful colors, or an almost bitter, anxious sounding melodic theme. But I think you'll find definitely in this first movement the slower parts, the more the andante parts. It almost seems like he finds like a grounding within all of that. And I kind of describe it as like finding like a lone flower in the midst of waste and ruin. But yeah, I feel like this sonata was overall more symphonic in nature as well, just because of the multiple layers of textures of work and orchestral sounding sections. I see it. But yeah, so Dr. Henkel and I talked about this, and I honestly didn't find any information on this, but supposedly this sonata was written for Sviatoslav Richter, because he was so inspired by him as a pianist. As the Soviets grew more and more corrupt in 1948, as a post-war policy, instilling obedience in Soviet artists, his music was denounced by the Central Committee, and he was forced to make a public admission of his guilt. So he was completely heartbroken and in despair, because that's like a career-altering experience. But even then, he continued to write. He continued to write all his emotions out, make edits to his music, and compose a 7th symphony. And then another interesting thing about his death, he died of a brain hemorrhage at age 61 on March 5th, 1953, which is the same day Joseph Stalin died. So that was a pretty interesting thing, because the government basically just kind of denounced his death, and they kind of hid it from the public, because he died on the same day as their grand leader, so they kind of wanted to hide like this less important individual, and only I think there's only 20 or 30 people came to his funeral, something like that. So it was really sad. But yeah, so kind of a troubled ending there. But yeah, so now a little bit about the pianist today. Sviatoslav Richter. Richter was a Russian-born pianist, March 20th, 1915. His father was an organist and a composer, taught him basic musical rudiments, but this was definitely like it helped him because it taught him the basics, but from a young age he was an incredible sight reader, and was unusually mostly self-taught, separate from being taught by his father, but his technique was completely self-taught, which kind of made him like a spiritual enigma, because he didn't get any formal training, but he just knew these technical things that you wouldn't know unless you had some sort of formal training at a conservatory or something, or with a high-regarded professor. And he played at a young age. He played with local ballet and opera companies in his area, and that definitely grew his sight reading ability even more, because of having to learn pieces in short periods of time. But for his ability as a pianist, it doesn't make sense how well formed his technique was. So he became an accompanist for the Odessa Academic Opera and Ballet Theater, and witnessed the pianist/piano teacher Heinrich Neuhaus, who also taught Emil Gilels, give a series of master classes at the conservatory, at Odessa Conservatory, and he was completely enthralled by this teacher. So in 1937, he decided to audition with Chopin's Fourth Ballade for lessons with him. But I remember Dr. Henkel told me another story about how he came in to Neuhaus, and they were kind of, because at the time he was already in his early 20s. So it was kind of weird having this person who didn't have any formal training at a past conservatory come into this place, and they kind of just looked at him and was like, oh, who is this guy? 22-year-old prodigy. But he came in, and then he asked Neuhaus, he was like, so what do you want me to play? And Neuhaus said, what do you mean? He said, name any piece, I'll play it. And then he said, what sonatas do you know of the, is it 32 Beethoven sonatas? And he said, all of them. And then what happened, he was like, so then he told him to play the hardest movement, or the hardest piece. The name is slipping from me right now. Help me with this. Henry Claudio. And he played it perfectly, and he played it amazing. And yeah, he kind of, and then after that, Neuhaus kind of regarded him as the musician of genius that he was always kind of searching for in his teaching career. And then Richter moved into his house and entered the Moscow Conservatory. And then in 1940, while still a student, he made his official debut as a pianist and played many works by Russian composers. And since Richter was personal friends with Prokofiev, and both were deeply inspired by each other, he secured the first ever performance of Prokofiev's four sonatas.
Very cool.
Yeah, at the conservatory, he would frequently, I thought this was a funny fact, at the conservatory, he would frequently skip compulsory political lessons. And he was expelled twice because of this, but he was always reinstated by Heinrich Neuhaus. You know, he would just be like, no, trust me, you know, this guy's good. We need him. Yeah, and then in 1949, he won the Stalin Prize, which led him through tours through East Europe, China, and Russia. And then he was finally allowed to perform in the U.S. in 1960. And he was a huge success, playing a series of sold-out concerts at Carnegie Hall. But touring was not what he liked to do at all. In his later years, he would only play on short notice, or in dark halls, or piano with just a lamplight illuminating his hands. And this was his kind of workman mentality about the piano. He really believed that it wasn't about watching the pianist at all. It was all about the music. It was all about what the music had to say to you, and not the showy, you know, what is this guy, kind of almost distracting from what's really going on. But yeah, so at age 81, he died in Moscow in 1997 from a heart attack while in preparation for a concert series. So yeah, this is the first. So this is the first movement of Prokofiev's seventh sonata, and yeah, played by Sandhills.